Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this noon hour East Coast presentation, Successful Transitions to Early Career. And this is presented by a group of individuals who make up the Veterinary Medical Education Initiative of the AAVMC. Next slide, please. So here's a brief overview of this presentation. You'll see this more than once. The first thing I would like to emphasize is at the bottom of the page, another encouragement to please go to menti.com, and put in that code 164001 so that you can participate in some polling that's actually going on even right now. This is, at this moment, a brief overview of the presentation. And then we're going to go through a series of steps defining the question around successful transitions to early career, some exemplars of how it's been addressed before we wrap up, and do some question and answers. So in addition to going to menti.com, please use the chat. Please use the chat. It is being surveyed by one of our members so that we can have a Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. What is the Veterinary Medical Education Initiative? Well, this is a group that was brought together to help address some of the key steps in the current AAVMC strategic plan, particularly around education, which would be goal 4, I think, to advance teaching to prepare students for success in a wide variety of careers. And our job is to recommend strategic priorities to the AAVMC based on gaps and opportunities that we address. It is not our job to do all of the work and complete an analysis, just to find those strategic areas that we may invest more resources in. To accomplish this, we brought together a group of experts from all of our international membership. Next slide, please. It's my pleasure to introduce the other 8 members of the group. Harold Bock from Utrecht, Martin Cake, up very early in the morning at Murdoch, Jennifer Hodgson from Virginia, Maryland, Laura Molgard from Minnesota, Laura Nelson, my colleague here at North Carolina State, Jacqueline Pelzer from Virginia, Maryland, Susan Rind from Edinburgh, and Sheena Warman from Bristol. In addition to the 9 of us, we've been incredibly well assisted by Josh Mintz of CHP Mintz, who's helped guide our thinking and development of through this process, and of course by Ted Mishima. Next slide, please. So this is envisaged to be a work that will go on for some time, and we had to pick a first project, as you might imagine, a lot of discussion and debate, but our ideas gelled around the perceived gap in our support for graduates in the transition to early career and development through the first several years of their life as a veterinarian. Therefore, our focus on successful transitions to early career. Again, I'm encouraging you to go to menti.com, and if we go to the next slide, we may be able to start seeing some answers to the question, did you feel, just wait for this question to load up here again, did you feel you had the preparation and support that you needed? And there's quite a diversity of responses here. Fair few people felt they did agree, and there are more answers coming in. And a number strongly agreed, a small number disagreed. So there's really an interesting balance of responses to this. And I want to thank the 27 people who have responded there already. Let's go to the next slide, please, Josh. Here is another question that we would really love to get your input in. And you can keep responding to this for a minute, and a word cloud is going to develop in the next slide. And the question, of course, is what do you see as the greatest challenge or challenges in making this successful transition? We'll give that a moment to come through. I'll remind you again, as you start hearing from all the presenters as we go forward, please put questions into the chat. I'll also point out in the very bottom line of the screen, right now you can see my name, but very soon you'll see more exciting names, and these will be the presenter at any given minute. And thank you very much. We've got 13 respondents already. Mentorship, leading the road, support, uncertainty, confidence, preparation for basic cases, learning how to work within constraints, support taking a stronger role here. So this is great to see these responses. We're doing okay on time. So let's keep them coming in for a moment and see how this develops, because this will help all of us who are getting ready to make a presentation here. Mentorship, confidence, support, uncertainty. Seems like we're developing some consensus. And thank you so much to the 28 people who have responded there. Okay, Josh, we'll go to the next slide, I think. Thank you very much. So we've done our overview. Now it's important to define what this question is. What really is the issue we're talking about? Have we got the same language here around what the challenge and the opportunity might be? So it's my pleasure with the next slide to introduce Sheena Warman to continue this presentation.
Great, thank you, Paul, and hello, everybody. So what do we know already about the transition to practice? We've got lots of anecdotal evidence from our own experiences and from those of our friends and our graduates. And idealistically, what we hope, what we want is that this is an opportunity for positive personal challenge. It's always going to be a challenging time. It's a big transition, but we want that to be a positive experience. And for many it is, many it does meet those expectations. But we also know that the experienced reality for many of our graduates and our colleagues can reflect back on this as well if they're later in career, that it's actually a time of significant stress and a time where there's a perceived and often real lack of support. There's, over the last 20 years, there's been quite a lot of published international studies, particularly from Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, the UK, confirming that this lack of support is real. We know that throughout the spectrum of our profession, we face major challenges with mental health and well-being. And we want to be able to support our graduates and get them off on a strong footing as best we can early in their careers. We've focused a lot in recent years in education and more traditionally as well on the development and the support of students and graduates as they develop their clinical skills. But more recently, there's a broader understanding that we also need to be supporting them to develop broader skills and to understand the emotional challenges that they face, the isolation some of them face moving from that relatively secure and normally incredibly social world of university life, and also thinking about the wider cultural aspects of professional life as they make that transition. Next slide, please. So from the schools side of things, what's been changed, what has evolved in our curricula over recent years to help to address these challenges that we've known about for a long time? We've moved beyond delivery of just knowledge-based curricula. There's a lot more emphasis now through different mechanisms on problem solving, clinical reasoning and broader professional reasoning, taking into account not just the clinical aspects of a case, but the values, the constraints, the finances, the realities of life in practice for many. There's been a much bigger focus on practical skill development, the massive increase and development of clinical skills labs, which are part and parcel of everyday life for all of us now, and the huge developments that have been made in terms of assessing clinical skills through OSCEs, through DOPS, through workplace-based assessment have all strengthened our graduates' clinical skill sets as they make the transition. And we've done lots around professional skills as well. So for all of us, there's a much bigger emphasis on communication with clients and within the team as well. Well-being and well-being curricula are well embedded in many programs now. There's been a bigger emphasis on reflection that has changed from being something that many of us ran away from, a bit scared by the word perhaps, to something that is part and parcel of everyday practice now for us as educators and for our graduates as they work through portfolios and work through many of the assignments where we support them to develop their reflective capacity. And a newer aspect of curricula that many of us are embedding now is around professional identity formation. So helping our students to understand who they are and who they want to be, what sort of vet they want to be, and then giving them the skills to navigate their journey through the profession in a way that meets their own values and aspirations. So we've done all this, or we're doing all this, and yet the challenges still persist, and that poses tricky questions for us. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we kind of do need to think about is that whilst most of our graduates will progress to jobs in primary care practice, for very many of us, particularly in schools with the more traditional setups, much of our graduates training takes place in the context of referral hospitals. Now, that has loads of advantages. We can ensure the quality of the training. We know they're being taught the right stuff and how to do things well, and they're aware of what the possibilities are. But there's some limitations in that as well. Are we equipping them well enough with the understanding and the creativity and the acceptance of the constraints that they'll meet in practice, the things they'll have to consider in terms of finances, skill availability, what role the animal plays in people's lives, the equipment available, and all those challenges that we know can make it difficult. So the question is, are we setting them up well enough for a wide range of career paths, and how well are we supporting them in their early years in practice? So with that, I'm going to pass over to Martin, who's going to explore how we might define success. Next slide, please.
Thanks very much, Sheena. So what Sheena's presented there is some of the challenges to a successful transition. And it's my job now to detour a little bit and consider how we might judge success. So what does success mean as a veterinarian? And I'd invite you to think about that, because it is one of our question slides coming up in a moment. So I think the equation is laid out very well in Bradley Viner's book that you can see on the screen there. He said success requires two ingredients: not only high quality care, and note there the caveat that he puts about efficient care provision, not necessarily gold standard, but also congruency with personal values, goals, intrinsic motivations, reward structures. So in a nutshell, not only being good at what you do, but enjoying doing it, finding the reward in it. Or to put it another way, both valuable for the client, the employer, the practice, and valued by the employee. Next slide, please. What we know about motivation and satisfaction in vet work is that these are largely derived from intrinsic motivations like continual learning, solving complex problems, as well as meaningful purpose that we find in helping patients and clients. But these motivations, fuel deep psychological needs essential for well-being, feelings of competence, connectedness, and as Bradley Viner noted, autonomous and self-congruent choice. So basically in vet work, we can find the rich ingredients for not only rewarding and satisfying work, but also eudaimonic or a deep-seated feeling of well-being, which does raise questions about why vet work is so often viewed as a threat to well-being, and what's going wrong here. So I suggest if we want success for our graduates, these are the types of reward structures that we should judge that success by. So for example, a really key one is a challenge, a feeling of solving problems is intrinsically rewarding, but that challenge needs to be the right degree, not too much, not too little. And so that's a really nice one to think about. Next slide, please. And finally, a third sort of lens on this is to think about success through the lens of employability. So employability is often defined around success and satisfaction in meaningful employment. So it captures not only the work readiness aspect of transition to work, but also that sustainability aspect of making sure that work is rewarding for all the parties involved. So the question of how employability translates in veterinary practice or in the veterinary context has been investigated fairly recently by this Vet Set to Go project. And that project identified 5 key domains, of which only one is the classical task-oriented competency, which you see down in the bottom left corner of that figure. So that suggests that there are some missing ingredients that might be eluding traditional vet education frameworks that could make a big difference to both graduates and their employers. And that does align very, very much with what employers are saying. So to bring that employer perspective, I will hand you now to Laura Mulgard and Laura Nelson. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Martin. So we know that self-evaluation is extremely important, but it has limitations, and the employers of our graduates have an important perspective that we do need to consider. So what do we know about where employers see our graduates struggle, and what sort of supports have employers needed to create to ease this transition into the workplace to succeed and gain satisfaction? So a few years ago, I had the opportunity to partner with Banfield to do a small study looking at the success of new graduates. Next slide. And in this study, we used structured interviews to ask those who worked really closely with new graduates in their practices in 2 states. And the states that were involved in this study happened to be Minnesota and California. We interviewed field directors, medical directors, chiefs of staff, and practice managers, as well as those year 1 DVMs themselves. Like the research Martin just described, the definition of success that came up was similar and much less detailed studies than Martin's, but aligned very nicely in that this is much bigger than financial metrics and much bigger than the veterinary capabilities. So the study participants described some key experiences that help successful grads become successful. And these included work experiences before graduation. Those could be work experiences in service settings, veterinary settings, or research. They also included volunteer experiences in veterinary and non-veterinary settings, including leadership roles in those volunteer settings. And additionally, they shared that successful new grads had experienced specific curricular experiences, which align nicely with what Sheena described a moment ago. The courses that were seen to make the biggest difference were clinical communications training, primary care rotations, general surgery and spay-neuter rotations, business and practice management courses, and research projects all showed up as specifically fostering success in that transition to practice. Now I'll turn things over to Laura Nelson to share some more recent conversations with employers.
Thank you, Laura. I've been fortunate to talk to representatives from Marv's Veterinary Health, which of course includes the Banfield, VCA, and Blue Pearl brands. I don't think I need to tell anybody on this call or this seminar that these are major employers in the veterinary field, particularly in North America. Their perspectives include working with new graduates across internship, residency, emergency, and primary care settings, and include graduates from a wide array of veterinary training programs. I was also able to learn more about the onboarding programs that the Army Veterinary Corps uses to orient and prepare new officers as they enter the Corps. From these sources, new graduates take between 14 and 18 months on average to meet full productivity, a term that's obviously financial, but that builds on the trajectory of new graduates and learning to maneuver a new work environment, supervise a care team, develop confidence in their skills, and to work efficiently through their days. Unfortunately, up to 30% of new graduates will leave their first job within a year. So for most of them, this will be before they've really found their feet in their first employment environment. And I'll talk more about steps that these employers are taking to improve retention and new associate success later in this presentation. These employers identified the following broad challenges. Most importantly, unsupported new graduates can feel abandoned. They need experience and often lack confidence in procedural and psychomotor skills, including surgery and dentistry. They have knowledge, but lack the confidence and practice in applying it, potentially in settings that are resource limited compared to the training environments they experienced. And they fear failure and negative feedback, including from clients on social media. Next slide, please. I know that our programs are thinking about these things too. However, we've all too commonly viewed our relationship with our graduates' employers as a handoff rather than a partnership. We have opportunities to grow in this area. As we continue to define the problem, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Jacqueline Peltzer, who'll move us into an overview of how we consider societal needs in our considerations of graduate success.
Thank you, Laura. So now we're heading into more of a philosophical discussion. And during yesterday's meeting, we heard some interesting perspectives regarding preparing students for the future of veterinary medicine. Dr. Blackwell is passionate about identifying societal needs and providing equal access to veterinary care, and Hal Gregerson spoke of the importance of leadership, innovation, communication, and listening skills on our quest for solutions to future challenges. When we consider the future and what is necessary for career transition and professional success, it is important to include student selection as part of the continuum. How we select applicants for an entry into the veterinary profession is a critical issue beyond professional boundaries and should include workforce and societal considerations. Veterinary school admission is the decisive moment of entrance into the profession and is arguably the most important selection process in veterinary education for determining who enters the workforce. Given the likelihood of veterinary school completion, the veterinary workforce is set at the time of admissions and should stimulate us all to consider other student selection factors with the goal of diversifying the composition of the workforce. Next slide, please. Veterinary students are typically selected after consideration of factors including grade point averages, standard testing, letters of recommendation, experiences, and interviews. Admission decisions are made on the limited information available to the committee, customarily using an applicant's past academic performance to predict future academic success. These decisions are predicting short-term educational outcomes. The overall importance of admissions decisions in determining the diversity and capacity of the veterinary workforce, all while meeting societal needs, has not been explicitly explored. Next slide, please. Many factors could impact career transition and future success of a new graduate. It seems reasonable that attributes other than intelligence or application of knowledge should be emphasized at the time of admission decisions, given the low attrition rates. Competent and confident veterinarians rely on leadership, teamwork, communication, conscientiousness, adaptiveness, and a host of other attributes for career transition and professional success. Admissions is an underutilized opportunity to fundamentally change the diversity of the veterinary workforce and address downstream societal needs. While there are benefits to our current selection factors, we should explore the evidence to redefine our admissions policies to shape the future of the veterinary workforce. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Paul Lund.
Jackie, thanks so much. I know during this process for me, hearing from you has been particularly powerful because you really informed me about an aspect of this that I'd never considered as much as I should. And I also want to thank the two Lauras and Martin and Sheena for outstanding presentations. And now I want to ask the audience, log on to Menti.com. We promise it won't steal your last tax submission. Get in there and give us a few words. Give us a very short sentence around what skills and attributes do new graduates need for early success. Just like the last word cloud we did, this is really powerful information for those of us who are working on this program. We'd like your ideas now, maybe your reactions to what you just heard. Skills and attributes New graduates' need for early career success. I'm going to leave this up here and let it dwell for a bit so we can see people's responses. And I think this poll, even when we need in a minute or two to move on to the next slide, I think this poll will keep running. So I'm getting a nod on another screen. So you can keep putting in these ideas while the rest of this talk goes on. Confidence, inclusive, change embracing, humility, not perfectionists, perseverance, balance of confidence and comfort with asking for help. That word humility coming through a lot, the word confidence coming through, communication and resilience, transferable skills, strong knowledge base, something many of my professors, I think, would emphasize, although like all of us, they're learning also that you need to be, as one writer says, prepared to be uncomfortable, have patience with themselves and openness to feedback. Something I could work on probably too. So there's some really great ideas coming through here. Keep putting these in, folks. I almost hate to move away from this page. Feeling connected to veterinary communities and state VMAs. Knowing your first job doesn't have to be a last job. Time management. Just some excellent ideas. Please do keep them coming. While that's going on, let's move to the next slide, but keep typing. We promise we'll share these, find a way to share them. That's really excellent. I'm very grateful to you. We've moved through our first attempt to define the question, although I'm sure that definition can be further refined. Now we'd like to talk more about exemplars of how we're addressing this, or how not only the universities through curriculum, but others in the workplace. And we'll stay on this slide, but we'll switch presenters to Dr. Jenny Hodgson, who is going to lead us into this section. Jenny.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. And so as Paul was just saying that so far in our discussion this afternoon, we've talked about this transition to practice, and we've heard about some of the issues with this transition from the perspective of both the student as well as the employer. But as he also mentioned, our group's also been discussing the question of how we might address this issue, and are there some exemplars out there that are currently within our DVM programs that are trying to address it, particularly from my perspective through the curriculum. So next slide, please. So historically, our models for training the next generation of veterinarians have been focused on inputs. That is, we've designed curricula by starting with the beginning, with the things that we think the students should be learning, and kept on adding things sequentially throughout their programs until we reach an endpoint at graduation. But more recently, it's become apparent that these curricula were not producing the graduates that were addressing either patient or societal needs, as well as the needs of the graduates themselves. And instead, we should be flipping our way of thinking about curricular design, so we focus on outputs rather than inputs. In other words, identifying what graduates should be able to do at the end of their programs and their training, and ensure that we're both teaching and assessing these outputs throughout their programs. So in the early 2000s, the AAVMA Council on Education introduced this focus on outputs in our accreditation requirements with their development of Standard 11 or outcomes assessment. And in this standard, they identified 9 clinical competencies for all day one graduates. But there remains some confusion in our veterinary programs as to exactly what we were trying to teach, and also how we were assessing these, but also too whether these competencies truly fully cover the needs of the day one graduate. So in order to address this, the AAVMC developed a working group to look more closely at competency-based veterinary education, or CBVE, and they subsequently developed 3 main products to help with implementation of a more outcomes-focused educational model that more clearly defines what our students should be able to do at graduation. Next slide, please. So the first of these products is a hierarchical competency framework that consists of domains of competence, then competencies, then illustrative subcompetencies. And together, these components provide a much more detailed framework for the outcomes required of our graduates. And they also include several domains of competence and underlying competencies that are not in currently the COE 9, including collaboration and teamwork, and the development of professional identity. And if you look at the competencies in this framework, you'll see reflected many of the words that have just come up in that word map that we had. So things like reflection, ability for lifelong learning. And as I said, through professional identity formation. So there's a number of those things that are now included in this framework. The second of these products are milestones, which are a narrative description of each of the competencies at various stages of student development, from novice to advanced beginner to competent to proficient. And in this way, the milestones provide students and faculty alike a really comprehensive roadmap for the expected graduate outcomes, thus making it clearer as to what they should be able to do at each step of the way towards graduation. And the last of these products are entrustable professional activities, or EPAs, where the CBVE working group has identified 8 core EPAs that encompass the routine activities undertaken in veterinary clinical practice. These activities are then further broken down into their key elements, which have been mapped to the CBVE competencies. And so by performing these EPAs in workplace-based settings in their clinical year, students are thus able to integrate and importantly, really practice these multiple competencies while gaining the competence and confidence in doing these routine veterinary activities. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that the CBVE competency framework, the milestones and the EPAs are really just a starting point. And we have a number of CBVE working groups whose focus is both on their implementation in veterinary programs and helping this, as well as evaluating their effectiveness. However, we also recognize that this is really an iterative process, and competencies may be added or modified associated with emerging trends in veterinary care, such as telehealth and telemedicine, or especially through feedback from stakeholders. So further feedback from the ones that we've already received. So, and then we can focus on more developing better this emphasis on certain aspects within the curriculum. And so these, again, some of the things that we've already talked about, such as resilience, or maybe focusing on some specific EPAs and further developing them around things like surgery or emergency and critical care. With this, now I'm going to turn it back over to Martin and Kate, who's going to talk about the Vet Set to Go model, which further expands on some of these curricular ideas. So thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. So those advances in competency-based vet education that Jenny's just presented are really important, and I think will be really effective in building that work readiness and that quality care element. If you think back to Bradley Viner's equation that I presented at the beginning. But one of the challenges that we face is that employability does extend beyond the notion of work readiness. It does consider a whole career. And as I said, it's not just about success as judged by a client or an employer, it's also as judged by the graduate themselves. So it does capture quite a few intangibles and quite hard to measure qualities. So things like commitment, motivation, adaptability, resilience, some of which Jenny mentioned, but these are pretty slippery capabilities. So the other thing, and this goes back to what Jackie was saying, is we need frameworks that prepare beyond day one for that long-term sustainability aspect and that future-proofing for those unknown emergent needs that actually Jenny just mentioned. So it's not just about those competencies for high quality practice, it's also about enabling capabilities. And this is what Ron Harden in his original work on outcomes-based education called approaches to practice. So not just what is done, but how it is done and why it is done. And then there's also that central meta competency, if you like, of reflective self-awareness, a absolutely critical skill, really the master key of the whole show, and something that overlaps quite a lot with classical professionalism that we've always taught, but in this context is more about constructing that really confident, robust professional identity. So there are, in other words, there's quite a lot of hidden psychosocial aspects that are hard to measure. They tend to filter out and drop out of objective, competency-driven approaches to assessment and curriculum. So the challenge that we have is that if we're serious about this idea of success and employability, is we do need to reflect these slippery capabilities, these harder to measure ones, quite prominently in our outcomes frameworks and our course learning outcomes. So what you see on the screen here is one example from an Australian vet school that has chosen to combine a modified and slightly cut down CBVE and EPA framework, which you see down in that bottom left corner, the sort of competency corner, with the other 4 domains of the Vet Set to Go employability framework. So when combined, they then yield 10 top-level course learning outcomes, of which 6 are the essential competencies, and you can see they're cross-matched with the ADPAs. And then the other 4 you might view as enabling capabilities and those approaches, as Ron Harden called it. Next slide, please. And then I didn't mention then that this does raise real challenges for assessing these more intangible qualities. Super important, but hard to measure. So here we see an example of self-assessment, a self-assessment and guided reflection tool that was developed by the Vet Set to Go project. So you can see students would rate themselves on this, and they're rating themselves as, this is a strength for me, or this is an area I need to develop. And the Vet Set to Go project concluded that self-reflection, triangulated by rich multi-source feedback from supervisors and peers, is the best way to guide development of these types of employability capabilities. Another really important element is complementing that classic, normative threshold competency model of assessment that we tend to use most commonly, with a system that identifies and grows the unique strengths of our graduates. And so thinking about strengths instead of limitations. And I think the idea of strengths does get a bit lost in that classic awareness of limitations paradigm that is, really, really core to the traditional idea of professionalism training. Okay, so in addition to those curriculum exemplars, there are multiple workplace examples for addressing these challenges. So I will hand you back to Laura Nelson to talk about those. Next slide, please.
Hello again. I spoke before about some of the challenges that employers we've had a chance to speak to identified in new graduates, but I think very encouragingly, in our discussions, we actually spent more time talking about the programming that they developed to address those challenges than the challenges themselves. Key among those, and this will come as no surprise based on the feedback we've received both through the Mentimeter and through others who presented with me today, are coaching and mentorship programs. And this is something that's really been across the board in discussion with multiple employers across different sectors. And importantly, an implementation of a mentor or mentorship program is training for the mentors. So taking professionals who are trained veterinarians and helping to develop them as effective mentors, effective in giving feedback, and helping to work with new graduates to make sure that they understand where the new graduate is and can provide the feedback and support that they need. Along with that comes mentor incentives. As many of us that work in veterinary educational settings know, mentoring, serving as an advisor is something that not only takes experience and some knowledge, but also time. And different practices have managed this, or different employers have managed this challenge by providing resources in terms of meal services and so on for clinicians who choose or elect to serve as mentors, even examples such as allowing a mentor to accept part of the production from a new graduate for coming in and assisting with an after hours. So there are different models out there, but I appreciate the recognition to training and rewarding the mentors and advisors. These larger employers particularly have also been very proactive in hiring well-being resources, so social workers that are working in clinical settings, and ensuring very specifically that graduates have access to mental health resources, because we know from experience with our students and from their feedback on our graduates that they use them, which is very encouraging. All of these employers talk about formalized onboarding programs. These reduce the need for new associates to learn the culture and expectations of their units by trial and error, and can help set off the relationship between the employee and the employer on a good setting. Many of them have employed competency-based veterinary education or adaptations of that system to early graduate development, particularly in-house officer programs, although these are also being developed for new associates working in primary care practice settings as well. And finally, they have provided resources in terms of knowledge. So developing libraries and resources that allow new graduates who have a pretty good knowledge base, but kind of want to check things a lot, moving away from that, here's some textbooks on a shelf, to having more comprehensive libraries of knowledge resources that really mirror those that they would have received or had access to when they were in a university setting, and making sure they have access to them. Another final thread through this is the idea of supported challenge. Our graduates are prepared, they're knowledgeable, they are able to take on the challenges that they need to encounter as new practitioners. They need support in balancing those challenges, not protection from the challenge. And so Mars Vet Health particularly remarked on moving from a model where they would kind of almost shield new graduates from very complicated cases or larger challenges, to how do we support our new practitioners in engaging with those so that they can grow in the confidence that they're actually able to take on the more complex situations that they'll continue to face throughout their careers. From here, I'm going to pass the presentation on to Susan Rind, who's going to share some details about the VET GDP program.
Thanks very much indeed, Laura, for that. So the last example that we wanted to share with you this afternoon relates to a national approach that's been taken to this issue in the United Kingdom. And in the UK, the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, who are the regulatory body for the profession in the UK, introduced something called the Professional Development Phase, or PDP, back in 2007. And as you can see here, the aim of the PDP was to support newly qualified graduates in this transition phase that we've been talking about this afternoon. And it was really designed as a period of structured self-assessment and reflection for the new graduates. And it was based around lists of competencies that students should aim for, ideally perhaps at the end of their first year in practice, for example. Now, what the Royal College did was, after 10 years of the PDP being in place, they commissioned a robust evaluation of how this system was working. The detailed report is available on the internet, but some of the key findings really were, well, the top one, I think, actually, which again speaks to a lot of the earlier part of this session, is about the real need for support within the workplace for this to work well. Absolutely essential, and in particular in relation to making reflection meaningful for the new graduates. So that was a major take-home message. Another common theme that came through this analysis was the need for this not to be seen as a tick box exercise, ticking lists of skills and so on. So that was a really useful evaluation of something, as I say, that was profession-wide. And this research then, together with a more recent large-scale review of graduate outcomes, carried out again across the profession in the UK, a lot of stakeholder input into that consultation, has culminated in the development of a new graduate development programme, a VET GDP, which is rolling out this year as we speak, actually. So if we can move to the next slide, I'll just talk about that in a bit more detail. So yes, the VET GDP is going to be launching this summer. So it's really hot off the press, this. I say it's informed by this research on the original PDP and this wider graduate outcomes review. And central to the approach in the VET GDP is a move from this list of competencies to the use of these entrustable professional activities that we heard in some of the earlier presentations this afternoon. And these EPAs would be constructed in dialogue with the individual and their mentor around that individual's role. So very much a sort of tailored approach to development. And again, I was struck by the early word cloud about what was important in transition, and that word mentorship and mentor coming out really strongly. And that is absolutely central to the VET GDP approach as well. And the advisors are being trained now, or about to start the training, and this will be online training from people in practice. This training will include the types of things, again, that we've heard come repeatedly as themes. It will include training on support for reflection, coaching techniques, giving effective feedback. All those types of things will be in that training. And then these mentors will be able to support the new graduates as they move into this phase. So clearly the VET GDP is very new. I mean, the paint is really not dry on it yet at all, but I think it's going to be really interesting to see the impact of this initiative, because it is significant, it's large scale, it's national, it's being driven by the regulator. And I think the other thing that I wanted to just pick up on here was going back to Laura's slide where we had partnership versus handing on the relay baton type of metaphor there. I think in this example, the regulator, the RCVS, are coming into the veterinary schools to talk to the students about the VET GDP and how they then move forward into that next phase in transition into the profession. So as I say, it'll be really interesting to reflect in a few years' time what impact this has had on the graduates and how they've progressed. So with that, I'm going to hand back now to Paul Lunn.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. And also thanks to Laura and Martin and Jennifer for those excellent presentations around exemplars, both from curricula and workplace settings. Time now for me to, for us to move to the wrap up and questions and answers. And just want to reach out to the audience. Please, any question, any comment, any thought, missing components of this, please put it in the chat. Send us some ideas here in the chat. I'm going to hand over at this point to Harold Bock in Utrecht.
Yes, thank you, Paul. As a wrap-up of today's session, I would like to zoom out and try to look at the bigger picture. And as illustrated this afternoon by all the different presenters, to support our graduates in making a successful transition to early career work, we have to look at the entire educational continuum. First, this includes rethinking the admissions procedures and use it as an opportunity to fundamentally change the veterinary workforce and address societal needs. Secondly, our curricula need to be designed in such a way that they optimally support our students in attaining the relevant competencies and create a learning environment that allow them to develop themselves with respect to relevant, for example, and trustable professional activities. However, simultaneously, to prepare our future professionals to perform at a high level in the complex and continuously changing society, we also have to design curricula that foster students in gaining the ability to deal effectively with novel situations and problems. This requires, for example, embracing frequent training in different and interdisciplinary situations, and encouraging learners to try out new things, utilize feedback, and having the opportunity to learn from mistakes. And finally, the workplace itself plays an essential role in the successful transition. Programs are required that support new graduates during the critical phase of their career, this critical early phase of their career. Supported practice, mentoring programs, the application of EPA frameworks, and formalized onboarding programs are, I think, all nice examples of how this could be accomplished. So, to conclude, it is the entire continuum we have to look at to better foster and develop the ability to gain and sustain meaningful employment in the increasingly complex and changing veterinary society. Well, now we have a few minutes for some questions from the audience, and we actually have received some great questions in the chat. And for the first question, I would like to ask, that first question is for Jennifer Hodgson. And the question is, the CBVE group has published some very valuable resources, for example, the competency framework, the EPAs, and the milestones that can be implemented in veterinary education. Can you comment on how these resources could potentially also be of value for the workplace and help employers to support new graduates in the transition to early career work?
Yeah, thanks, Harold, and thanks for making me go first. But that's okay, that's fine. So yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it's certainly something that we have been thinking about, and also having some really early conversations with a number of different groups. And as in human medicine, sometimes those groups are focused on specialty areas, and so we've been talking to groups with emergency critical care and saying how can we extend those the competency framework, particularly things like the milestones and then potentially EPAs. How can we extend those for what they might be able to do around that domain after graduation? And so that's just one example, but we're talking to a variety of groups. And so I think that one thing that we can help do, particularly at the CBVE working group, is also to all of us have a common mental model of what all of these things are. And I think that what we've found in medical education is that there's often not that shared model of what these things are and what they can do. And so there's a whole lot of variation in their implementation then. And a lot of confusion about what it is they can do and how it is that you develop them. So I think that that's one thing that we're really keen on saying is this is really what we mean by a competency framework. This is really what we mean by an EPA, and this is what we mean by milestones. And this is how you can develop them potentially for postgraduate programs or postgraduate learning in a whole variety of different ways. But it's really, really important that we use the same language and we use the same ideas and have them develop sequentially rather than changing into something completely different post-graduation.
Yes, thank you very much, Jennifer.
And Harold, you've had a lot of experience with competency frameworks and things like that, and also to potentially develop in the postgraduate. So please chime in and add things as well.
Yes, thank you very much. There are a few other questions. I have a next one for Laura Nelson. In your communications with Mars Animal Health and the Army Veterinary Corps, can you comment on their receptivity to collaborating with the colleges of veterinary medicine on transitioning students into their early career? And maybe in addition to that, most of our students are still employed by small practices, actually, with limited resources. And maybe you could also elaborate a little bit on how we could help those students.
Absolutely. So, so first of all, for Mars Veterinary Health, we're tremendously engaged and excited in talking to us about their programs and have shared a number of resources with us. And I'm really looking forward to continuing to partner with them. And there are a couple elements of that partnership. I think some of it is learning more about their programs. Some of it is that they have a great deal of data about how our new graduates perform. And it's not that I want to find out if my school is better than some other school, but it's a way for us as colleges, as we develop programs that we think are going to improve new graduate success, to see if that's working. So to refine those programs, to identify exemplars within our schools and to get some data to back up what's working and what's not. So I think there's a feedback element of that that's really exciting. And I think as they develop their new associate support programs and training, I'm hopeful that some of those practices are going to be adapted for application in smaller practices as well. I know from talking to our career services folks that the job market for many of our graduates is pretty competitive right now. And I think we're already seeing that smaller practices are catching up a little bit with some of the things that the larger corporates are able to do, simply because graduates are asking for it. They're asking for mentorship programs, they're asking for advising programs. So there's a market element of that. And I think also an opportunity to see how those smaller practice groups, those individual practices are taking what they're learning from discussions like this about where new graduates are succeeding and where they need more support, and seeing what they can create again that can feed into the larger discussion. So I'm kind of excited about the data feedback, but I'm also really excited about what are the things that we can help new practices to identify. One observation as I'm kind of listening to a talk that I'm very familiar with is that we also have an opportunity to work with providers of veterinary CE. And over the last 10 years, I've seen a lot more not just interest in practice management, but how do you manage employees? How do you build your team? How do you manage a practice climate? And I think that this ties very well into that too. So I expect that our veterinary CE conferences and providers are going to be taking advantage of this and be partners in it as well, because all of us, employers, schools, and our graduates and the veterinarians are engaged in building workplaces that people want to stay in and have successful careers.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much. Then I have another question for Sheena Warman. The global composition of the steering committee is really very much appreciated. And the question is, are there any insights you can share about major differences between countries regarding the challenges encountered in the transition of students to practice? Sheena, would you be able to comment on that?
Yeah, she's frozen.
She's frozen. Maybe Susan, is that something you could comment on?
Yes, thanks, Harold. So I think that I would say from the research that there's not a lot of research, but there is some. I would say that the overwhelming message is that the challenges that are faced are pretty much universal, regardless of where you are. Now, there may be some very specific geographical areas where the research hasn't been done, but I think these issues of needing support and mentorship and the issues around confidence and so on are, I would say, in by my understanding and in the research that's out there, pretty much universal. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Susan. I have one. I can ask one final question, and then I have to turn over the. Then we have to go back to Polen. One final question for Martin. In the Mentimeter question, adaptability and adaptive skills were mentioned as important for new graduates for early career success. Could you very short elaborate on how the development of these skills can be incorporated within the veterinary training, within the veterinary program?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So adaptability, if you look at any work on employability, adaptability often pops out as a really key element. And it's a really key part of that future-proofing. So you know, if you can adapt to novel situations, if you can use knowledge and apply it to new situations, then you're really well set up. I think that's a very familiar concept for vets. The other element is adaptability is also part of resilience. So really vital elements. But these are hard to incorporate in curricula because you need to expose students to unpredictable situations. And you need to get that right, because too much unpredictability is going to be really destructive for their learning, and too little will not achieve the aim. So it is tricky. And it actually, so that really is the key, is actually trying to give students situations where they're presented without complete information, maybe without clear goals, and expecting them to try and navigate it.
Thank you very much, Martin. My thanks to everyone for the great questions. And now let's turn back to Paul to discuss the next steps. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Harold, for a great wrap up, and also for running those questions. And thanks to everybody who participated in answering. I really want to thank the audience for the feedback we've already had through the surveys that we've done. And I very much hope we can find ways to incorporate more feedback. None of us are hard to find on the web. Please send us your ideas as we go forward. Our job now is to sort of complete this journey, take the feedback we've had today and synthesize the ideas that you've had and make a recommendation to the board of directors of the AAVMC for how we can bring some collaborative, interdisciplinary progress to this critical area. Perhaps there'll be a working group. I'm not sure what that structure would be, but we certainly don't intend to end this process with this presentation. Really encouraging, though, to see how much effort and how much accomplishment there's already been. When this work is completed, when our report, whatever form it might take, is done, this group may reform. There may be opportunity for new members to join. Some current members may decide to branch off and focus on a career transition. And the hope for the VMEI is it will move on to its next strategic priority. We are 1 minute after the hour. I want to thank the man in the background, Josh Mintz especially, and also Ted Mishima for all their help today. Thank you to the audience, and of course to all the amazing presenters. And if they can stay on the line for a moment, we may be able to do a little bit of post-analysis, even though Martin needs to get to bed very, very soon. But thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the meeting. Thank you.